The chill of the late autumn morning crept through the stone corridors of Westminster Abbey, making even the warmest robes feel like parchment against the skin. A priest, aged and solemn, stood gripping his prayer book near the altar, the ancient pages fluttering gently in the breeze that snaked in through the narrow stained glass windows. He had presided over many unions in his lifetime, lords and ladies, dukes and duchesses, but never had he felt such unease swirl around a royal ceremony. The air carried whispers, not merely of reverence, but of disbelief, confusion, and veiled tension. Servants scurried like ants before rain, adjusting tapestries, lighting dozens of beeswax candles, and laying garlands along the aisles. Courtiers loitered just beyond the nave, their silken sleeves brushing one another as they craned their necks toward the towering doors. Everyone knew that today would not be a day of romance or celebration in the traditional sense. Today would be one of politics, of treaties etched not in ink but in wedding vows. The creak of the great oak doors shattered the murmuring silence. The crowd turned, and the priest's breath caught in his throat. At first, he saw only the figure of King Richard Roman too majestic, tall, and gilded in regal finery, his golden hair gleaming beneath the jeweled crown. His presence was commanding, the kind that could hush a room with a single glance, but it wasn't the king who stunned the priest, it was who walked beside him, or rather, who he led, a child, barely past infancy in the eyes of the priest, stood timidly at Richard's side. Her hand, encased in his gloved one, looked no larger than a sparrow's wing. She wore a lavish French gown stitched with pearls so large they threatened to pull her tiny shoulders downward. Her hair was dark and intricately braided, the strands nearly disappearing beneath the weight of her ceremonial headpiece. She walked like a doll being guided, uncertain yet composed, her eyes wide as she beheld the vast arches and towering stone columns of England's spiritual heart. Isabella of Valois, the new Queen of England, the priest's fingers trembled, not from cold now, but from the conflict he felt within. He had married girls of noble birth at 12 or even 13. It was common practice among the aristocracy, especially in such volatile times. Yet never had he joined a man of 20, 9 to a bride of 6. She looked more like a flower girl than a queen. He reminded himself of the plague, the wars, the fragility of alliances. 50 years ago, death had roamed the land like a spectre, having the population in its wake. Kings did what was necessary. Treaties sealed in blood rarely lasted. Treaties sealed in marriage had a better chance. As the vows began, he watched her closely. Isabella did not appear frightened. Her dark eyes, intelligent and unblinking, drank in the spectacle before her. The glowing candles, the rich silks, the rustle of nobles, and the deep, sonorous chant of the choir. She was a child of court and ceremony, trained to mask fear behind curious stillness. Richard's voice, when it came, was soft, almost tender. There was no lust in his eyes, no hunger. Instead, there was a kind of solemn pity, the way one might look at a dove caged in gold. He spoke to her like a protector, not a partner. Everyone understood. This marriage would not be consummated. Isabella would live in the English court until she came of age. It was a gesture of peace between England and France, between two war-sickened kingdoms weary from blood and fire. The priest raised his hand, gave the final blessing, and spoke the sacred words, husband, wife. The titles hung in the air like incense, strange and heavy. Isabella's head dipped slightly in response. The moment passed, and the future of two kingdoms shifted with it. Still clutching his prayer book, the priest looked once more at the girl, her crown glinting too brightly for her young brow. What life would she know now, uprooted from France, encircled by foreign tongues, and foreign expectations, she was no longer merely a princess. She was a pawn, played early and with precision, a child queen in a game that ate even the strongest alive. The world would remember Richard, but would it remember her? Not long after the wedding bells had faded into the mist of memory, Isabella's name began to slip from the lips of common folk. England's streets, clogged with vendors and hawkers, rarely mentioned the French girl in the palace. But within the castle walls, everything she did mattered. Every lesson, every misstep, every word she spoke was observed, recorded, discussed. She was born in the gilded halls of the Louvre Palace in Paris on the 9th of November, 1389. Her infancy was spent among silks and stained glass, but behind the grandeur was a fragile kingdom teetering under the madness of its king, her father, Charles VI. Though known as Charles the Beloved, in his sane moments he was more widely feared as Charles the Mad. His illness, unpredictable and terrifying, turned the palace into a place of both splendor and dread. Isabella remembered the moments vividly, though no one believed a child so young could. The way the guards would seize their swords when her father screamed of invisible enemies. The way servants swept her and her siblings out of the halls when Charles, glassy, eyed and trembling, muttered that he was made of glass and might shatter if touched. She would later recall how he'd sometimes forget who he was entirely, addressing her as a stranger while her mother wept quietly in the corner. Her mother, Queen Isabel of Bavaria, was not a gentle woman, but she was clever enough to know that her children were worth more as bargaining chips than as beloved companions. She saw in Isabella not a daughter, but a golden bridge to foreign alliances. The girl's wide eyes and noble blood could buy peace, could buy power, and peace was dearly needed. England and France had warred for decades. The 100 Years' War had begun as a dynastic dispute and metastasized into something greater, an unending struggle that bled both nations dry. Isabella's marriage was not just a political gesture. It was a desperate attempt to pause the carnage, if not end it. When King Richard's ambassadors arrived in Paris, their robes were still tinged with mourning. Richard had lost his first wife, Anne of Bohemia, just a year before. He had loved her genuinely, something rare in royal unions. Her death from plague devastated him, leaving not only a gap in his heart, but in the line of succession. His counselors urged him to marry again quickly. An heirless king invited civil war. Richard resisted, but when he saw the miniature portrait of Isabella, he paused. Perhaps it was the innocence in her face, or the vulnerability, or perhaps something gentler, an instinct to protect. Here was a child who could not betray him, who would not conspire, who would be loyal only because she knew no other path, and so she was sent to England. The sea voyage was brief but jarring. She had never left her homeland before. The air felt colder in England, the language harsher. Even the colors seemed less vivid. On the day of the wedding, she wore a gown so heavily embroidered with gold and pearls that it took 2 maids to help her walk. Her husband, a king nearly 5 times her age, knelt before her as they exchanged rings. Witnesses remembered how gently he lifted her chin when she flinched at the crowd of staring nobles. A year later, she was crowned at Westminster Abbey. Though the crowd was smaller than expected, and some whispered unease at such a youthful queen, the ceremony marked her official place in England's tapestry. She belonged now to both crowns and to none. Her chambers were fitted with the finest French tapestries, and a household was selected carefully, a blend of French and English attendants. Some whispered that she was pampered beyond reason. Others feared that Richard, in his grief and loneliness, would smother the girl with attention. But in truth, he remained distant, paternal but not affectionate. Isabella's days were filled with lessons in language, embroidery, music, and the strict etiquette of English court life. Among her closest companions was Margaret Holland, a noble girl a few years older, who quickly became both friend and tutor. Margaret spoke to her of England's bloody past, of noble feuds that stretched back generations, of Richard's fragile hold on power. Isabella, sharp and observant, listened carefully. She was learning to survive. Isabella's world inside Westminster gradually became more than a golden cage. The towering walls, once foreboding, began to feel like familiar companions. Her steps no longer hesitated in the maze of narrow stone corridors, and the smell of damp parchment and beeswax candles became oddly comforting. She learned to move gracefully through court life, responding to bows with nods, curtsies with practiced gentility, her child's face framed by an unnatural maturity. Richard, though often absent, remained a hovering presence in her life. He insisted she be taught to read and write in both French and English. Her tutors brought her ancient chronicles and courtly romances, illuminating the histories of both her bloodlines. She wrote in a delicate hand, her script flowing across vellum with surprising steadiness. Her favorite lessons, however, were with Margaret Holland. They sat together in the garden, surrounded by lavender and rose hips, bent over embroidery while Margaret whispered secrets of English nobility, of betrayals, hidden rivalries, and shifting allegiances masked by silk smiles. Margaret was no ordinary attendant. She was the daughter of a powerful noble house, and had seen firsthand how quickly fortunes could rise and fall. Yet she treated Isabella not just as a queen, but as a friend, teaching her how to sense a lie, how to endure a veiled insult, how to smile at a threat. Together, they built a sisterhood that made the foreign halls of England feel less lonely. Still, Isabella often thought of France. At night, wrapped in thick woolen blankets beside the embers of her chamber's hearth, she dreamed of the Louvre, the scent of lilac in spring, her siblings' laughter echoing in marble halls, the trembling voice of her father during moments of clarity. She remembered his eyes when he recognized her, even for fleeting seconds, calling her ma petite étoile, my little star, but her memories clashed against the realpolitik of England's court. The nobles eyed Richard with suspicion. Though a Plantagenet king, he had never fully earned their loyalty. His reliance on select advisers, his peace overtures toward France, and his opulent court style were criticized as vanity. Some whispered he was too forgiving. Others said he had grown paranoid. Even within his inner circle, unrest stirred. The lords of the north, the Percys, the Boling, Brokes watched him with increasing resentment. Richard saw this. So did Margaret. And now so did Isabella. The change came slowly. Richard's visits to Isabella became rarer. When he did appear, he often stood silently at her window, staring toward the river Thames, as though expecting enemies to arrive on ghost ships. He brought fewer gifts, he spoke in riddles. At first Isabella thought he was simply mourning Anne of Bohemia again, but Margaret knew better. Something was moving in the kingdom, something darker than grief. One afternoon Margaret entered Isabella's chamber, her face pale beneath her headdress. She asked the maids to leave, then she locked the door. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "you must pack only what's essential. There will be no procession. We're leaving for the Tower." Isabella blinked. "Why the Tower? Have I done something?" Margaret shook her head and reached out to take her hand. "No, child, but the world outside these walls has changed." That night, under a moon cloaked in cloud, they left the palace. Gone were the heralds and trumpets, gone were the silk banners and fanfare. Instead, A tightly formed company of guards escorted her through the sleeping city in a curtained litter. The streets smelled of whetstone and old smoke. London no longer felt like a capital. It felt like a trap. At the Tower there was no formal welcome. The soldiers wore no smiles. Her chambers, while still furnished with tapestries and cushions, lacked the warmth of Westminster. It was neither prison nor palace, but it could become either at any moment. It was there, days later, that Richard came to her once more. The flicker of torchlight cast sharp shadows across his face, and his voice had lost all trace of courtly melody. He sat beside her, his usual ceremonial distance forgotten. "Isabella," he said, "not your majesty, not my queen. Just her name. The lords have turned against me. Henry of Bolingbroke claims my crown. The great houses have abandoned me." She looked at him, too stunned to speak. At 10, she understood more than anyone believed. "What will happen to me?" she asked softly. Richard met her eyes. "I do not know." Those were the last words they would ever share. Not long afterward, Richard vanished from public life. Rumors trickled in. Some said he had been taken to Pontefract Castle. Others claimed he had been sent abroad. The truth, however, was grimmer. Soon, whispers began that he had died in captivity, then that he had been murdered. When confirmation finally arrived, Isabella was alone in her chamber, sunlight slanting through the narrow window. Margaret read the letter aloud. Richard was dead. She did not cry. She had never loved him, not as a wife, but he had been kind, and in this strange world he had been the only steady thing she had. He had shielded her from the worst of court cruelty. He had made her feel, if not loved, then respected. That night she did not sleep. Instead, she watched the stars over the Tower and whispered good-bye to a man she had called husband in name only, but who had, in his own strange way, protected her more than any night. Now she was no longer a queen, just a foreign girl in a hostile court. The Tower remained still, suspended in a breathless pause, as the court decided what to do with the child who had once been queen. Isabella's status was a delicate matter. Though just a girl, her identity carried weight beyond her years. She was the daughter of the King of France, the widow at least by name of England's deposed and now dead monarch. Her presence could inflame loyalties or quiet rebellion. Depending on how she was handled, she could be a threat or an asset. Henry Bolingbroke had taken the throne, crowned now as Henry Roman IV. To the people, he was a decisive ruler. To many nobles, a restorer of order. But to Isabella, he was the man who had destroyed the only life she had ever known in England. Their meeting was arranged with ceremonial awkwardness. She was instructed on protocol, how to curtsy, how to greet him as Your Grace. Yet she also understood that nothing about this encounter was about etiquette. It was survival. He came to her chamber one misty morning. She stood when he entered, the rustle of her gown sounding impossibly loud in the heavy silence. When she looked up at him, she saw not a monster, but a man weighed down by power. His eyes studied her not with cruelty, but with calculation. She curtsied deeply, as taught. "Your Grace." Henry said nothing for a moment. Then, almost reluctantly, he returned her courtesy. "Your Grace," he replied. The air shifted. He sat across from her and folded his hands. "These are difficult times." He began, choosing each word with precision. "There are those who would use your name to challenge my rule, others who would prefer you, far from here." Isabella said nothing. She only listened. Henry studied her again, noting the calm in her face, the composed stillness of her hands. "You are wise beyond your years," he admitted, "but wisdom cannot shield you from what may come. You must consider returning to France." She inhaled, not because the idea was shocking, but because the truth of it had finally been spoken. Her homeland, her family, her real name, but England had changed her. She was not the same girl who had arrived years earlier in a pearl-studded gown. She had learned to read lies in glances, to listen beyond words. She had grown under Richard's shadow. Now she stood in her own. In the weeks that followed, her fate hung in uncertainty. Some of Henry's advisers urged immediate repatriation. It would save money, remove political risk, and signal a clean break with Richard's reign. Others were cautious. Sending her back too quickly might anger the French court, or worse, it might give France cause to support a pretender claiming to avenge Richard's death. In the end, Henry allowed her to remain for a time. She was neither prisoner nor guest. She lived in suspended diplomacy. Then came the news that shattered the balance. Richard was dead, officially, unarguably. There had been whispers before, but now came the seal, the scroll, the confirmation no one could ignore. Isabella, though still a child, felt the world tip beneath her feet. His death had ended the last tether holding her to England. Her crown meant nothing now. Her title was smoke. Her marriage, once celebrated beneath the high arches of Westminster, was now a closed chapter, barely a footnote in a rapidly rewriting history. She wept alone, not for the loss of love, she had never known it, but for the loss of safety, of purpose, of the man who, despite everything, had made her more than just a pawn. When the French court finally sent envoys to bring her home, England hesitated. Henry's advisers debated terms, unsure whether to treat her as an honored guest or an inconvenient symbol. Eventually, a compromise was reached. She would be returned, but her dowry would be disputed. She would leave with dignity, but not with favor. The journey home was subdued. There were no celebrations, no songs of welcome. Isabella left behind the only language she had spoken for years, the only gardens she had known, the people who had become both comfort and cage. When her ship landed in France, the sky was gray and the wind sharp with salt. She stepped onto the shore with a heavy heart. She was 11 now, older, quieter, carved by experience her family would never understand. At court, her return was a spectacle of conflicting emotions. Her mother, Isabeau, welcomed her with rigid arms, more ceremonial than warm. Her younger siblings stared at her with curiosity and caution, unsure if this solemn girl in English velve, it was truly their sister. Her father, King Charles VI, was in one of his darkest episodes. He did not recognize her. He screamed of assassins, raved about invisible beasts, and refused to eat unless his food was tasted 3 times. Isabella's presence did not pierce his madness. He called her a demon, then a saint, then wept and begged her forgiveness for crimes he could not name. She watched him with the same silence she had learned in London. There was no fear in her eyes anymore, only understanding. In time, Charles regained fragments of clarity. He saw her and remembered, briefly, that she was his daughter. He embraced her then, with the awkwardness of a man unsure of his own mind. It was enough. It was more than she had expected, yet her troubles were not behind her. She was still a girl of great consequence. Her brief reign as Queen of England had made her valuable and dangerous. Suitors came quickly. Letters arrived from dukes and lords across Europe. Some sought alliance, others saw opportunity. All saw her as something to be claimed, but Isabella, tempered by exile, was no longer compliant. She listened politely, she offered smiles, but inside she was cautious. She had been married once before, in a ceremony that was not hers to choose. If she were to marry again, it would be for more than treaties. Among the many suitors, one man stood apart. Charles, Duke of Orleans. He was close in age, only slightly older, and known as a patron of the arts, a poet, a soldier. He was respected but not feared, intelligent but not arrogant. Most importantly, he spoke to Isabella not as a commodity, but as a woman. In one private meeting, he looked into her eyes and said, "I do not seek the widow of a dead king. I seek the woman who has lived through 2 courts and remained unbroken." And for the first time, Isabella's heart stirred not with dread, but with possibility. The bells that rang on the morning of Isabella's second wedding were not thunderous like those in London. They were lighter, more lyrical, French bells, ringing not in a kingdom's cathedral, but in a quieter town chapel, far from the shadow of empire. There were no banners stretched across entire cities, no sea of lords in crimson velvet, no cheering mobs. Just dignitaries, musicians, poets, and nobles who understood that this union was not one of conquest or politics. It was a union of healing. She was older now, nearly 17, and though her age still placed her within the bloom of youth, her eyes no longer held the soft curiosity of a child. They carried the clarity of someone who had already been queen and widow, someone who had watched kingdoms rise and fall before she had even come of age. Charles, Duke of Orleans, stood beside her in a robe of muted blue and gold, embroidered with lilies and suns. His expression was gentle, but his posture strong. He did not touch her until the vows were spoken, and when he did, it was not the grip of ownership. It was an anchor, as if he recognized in her the depth of waters she had already crossed. Their wedding, though quiet by royal standards, was not devoid of beauty. Songs composed in honor of Isabella's endurance were sung by choirs. Florists had draped the chapel in peonies and ivy. A manuscript recording the day would later depict a radiant bride in silver, threaded silk, a gold fillet resting on her temple, walking beside a man who neither led nor followed, but walked in step. Their marriage, while born from alliance, quickly grew into something deeper. Charles, unlike Richard or the men of her mother's court, had no desire to dominate. He wrote her poems, sometimes silly, sometimes philosophical, always tender. When he returned from hunts or battles, he would bring her pressed flowers or a few lines scribbled on parchment. They read together, they debated, they prayed. For Isabella, it was the first time she was allowed to be a woman, not just a political symbol, but life, especially for those of noble birth, rarely allowed long spells of peace. The 100 Years' War still smoldered across France. Tensions simmered between Armagnacs and Burgundians. Charles, as a duke and a royal cousin, was inevitably drawn into the conflicts. Isabella saw him off to battle more than once. Each time she stood on the castle balcony, her hand pressed over her heart, watching his banner disappear into the forested horizon. And each time she whispered prayers not just for his safety, but for the fragile happiness she had finally found. Though theirs was a marriage of mutual care, it was not long before Isabella became pregnant, her chambers filled with the soft murmur of nurses, midwives, and older women offering advice. She bore the strain quietly, already too familiar with the burdens of royalty to make noise about her own discomfort. Yet this child was different. It was hers, not the crown's, not England's, not France's. It belonged to no treaty or throne. It was flesh of her flesh, born of choice, not arrangement. When the time came, she labored for 2 days, her body racked with pain, her hand gripping Charles's ring, as if it were the last real thing anchoring her to the world. But when the baby was finally born, a daughter, small and quiet, Isabella wept not from sorrow, but from joy. The girl was named Jean. Charles held their daughter first, his hands trembling slightly. He brought the child to Isabella and whispered, "She is the shape of a new beginning." For weeks they lived in a blur of lullabies, sweet milk, and poetry, but outside their walls the world grew darker. In 1407, Louis I, Duke of Orleans, Charles's father, was assassinated in the streets of Paris, allegedly on orders of John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. The fallout was immediate. Nobles chose sides. Blood debts were sworn. Cities prepared for siege. Charles, now inheriting his father's position and fury, was pulled into the center of a civil war. Isabella stood beside him when the banners of Orleans were raised in defiance. She advised with the calm precision of someone who had witnessed power collapse. Though she never held a sword, her words became armor, but tragedy, it seemed, would not leave her untouched for long. In 1409, Isabella's health began to falter. First it was fatigue, then fever. Physicians offered a dozen diagnoses, none of them certain. Charles called the best healers from Paris. They bled her, applied leeches, chanted prayers, offered tinctures brewed from root and bone. Still, her body grew weaker. Some whispered it was the years in England that had cursed her. Others blamed the strain of childbirth, or the grief that still clung to her bones. A few even muttered the name of Richard, suggesting that a bond severed too cruelly might never let her go. Isabella herself said little. She spent her last weeks reading old letters, watching Jean sleep, and listening to Charles compose verses beneath the window. She asked for no relics, only quiet. On a warm September day, with sun spilling across her bed like golden silk, Isabella closed her eyes and did not open them again. She was just 19. France wept for her, though history would soon move on. Chronicles would record her as a daughter, a queen, a wife, a duchess. Few would know her as a girl who had survived empires before she had survived adolescence. Charles mourned deeply. For months he refused to remarry. He wore black longer than custom required, and though he would one day return to court life, he never again wrote a poem without her name somewhere hidden in its lines. Isabella was buried with quiet honors. No triumphal tomb, no marble effigy of warlike grandeur, just a carved inscription, Isabelle de France, Reine d'Angleterre, Duchess d'Orleans, a woman born to be forgotten, yet who had never once lived quietly. News of Isabella's death traveled slowly, but the grief it carried moved swiftly through the courts of both France and England. She had died a duchess, not a queen, and yet her absence left an unmistakable hollow in the minds of those who had once orbited her rare dignity. In France, her daughter Jean grew up under the careful watch of Charles. Though still a boy himself when he lost Isabella, he never faltered in his duties. He raised their child with an almost sacred reverence, telling her stories of her mother, not just as a royal, but as a brave, gentle soul who had once walked through kingdoms as if they were thorns beneath her feet, and she a barefoot girl. Jean would grow up knowing her mother not from statues or royal murals, but from poetry. Charles's verses, written in sorrowed ink, whispered Isabella's name like a prayer. In one illuminated manuscript kept in the court library, a page shimmered with golden leafing and reed, "My dove, who sang under foreign crowns and taught silence to kings." Yet even as Isabella faded into memory, the echoes of her choices influenced the tangled politics that continued to unfold across Europe. In England, King Henry Roman IV remained wary of Isabella's legacy. Though he had once allowed her safe return to France, the old guard whispered that her presence in the country, her memory as Richard Roman II's wife, had inspired sympathy among the commoners. Some had begun calling her Reine perdue, the lost queen. Rumors lingered that she had left behind a secret letter claiming Richard had been murdered, that she had once buried a locket beneath Westminster's altar, that she had cursed the usurper's bloodline. None of it was confirmed, all of it was feared. It was this unease that led Henry Roman IV to keep tight reins on his own court's chroniclers. They were instructed to mention Isabella sparingly, if at all. Her name was quietly erased from ceremonies, her presence airbrushed from paintings, her story buried beneath newer, louder ones. But memory has a way of blooming where it's been forbidden. In quiet corners of convents, aging ladies in waiting recalled her as the gentle girl who loved books more than feasts. In Parisian salons, poets raised toasts to La Réunie de Patience. In the halls of Orleans, she was remembered as the one who taught Charles not just how to lead, but how to endure. By the time Charles was captured in 1415 during the Battle of Agincourt and imprisoned in England, he carried Isabella's memory with him like a relic. Even in captivity, when cold English stone walls pressed in on him, he wrote sonnets that compared her eyes to the moonlight he could no longer see. He would spend nearly 25 years as a prisoner of the English crown. But not once did he forget the girl who had once crossed oceans to be queen, and had returned home as a woman determined to write her own ending. While Charles remained in captivity, Jean grew into a quiet but astute noblewoman. Though she never wore a crown, her lineage ensured she would become a marriage prize in her own right. Yet, like her mother, Jean carried herself with an air of gentleness that disarmed even the most hardened negotiators. She married John Roman, too, Duke of Alençon, and bore children who would continue the lines of nobility. But in her household, a portrait of Isabella hung above the chapel door, not a regal rendering, but a soft painting done from memory, showing her with hands clasped in prayer, her eyes lifted not to heaven, but towards some distant light. Generations passed, kingdoms changed hands, wars continued, and still Isabella's story remained elusive, spoken more in quiet admiration than in grand ceremony. It wasn't until the 16th century that a young scholar named Etienne Duclerc stumbled upon a forgotten manuscript in the archives of the Château d'Amboise. Bound in aging leather, the document was titled simply Vie d'Isabelle Réunie de Paix. The pages were fragile, the ink faded, but the words within revealed a life far more intricate than mere footnotes could hold. It contained letters, real ones, some written by Richard Roman II in his own hand, full of tenderness and political anguish. Others were from Isabella herself, in a careful, almost delicate French script. One letter, dated 1399, read, "I do not know what shape love should take in a world of thrones, but I have seen it in kindness, in quietness, in the waiting, and in that I am queen enough." The manuscript's discovery led to renewed interest in Isabella's life. Academics began piecing together her timeline, not just from the great events, but from the smaller truths. The fact that she once gave away her wedding jewels to feed orphan children during a famine, that she taught village girls to read from a psalter, that she ordered candles lit every year on Richard's death day. She had never ruled a kingdom with power, but she had influenced one with grace. In later centuries, playwrights and novelists reimagined her tale. Some romanticized it, others embellished the politics, a few twisted it into tragedy. But none could quite capture the quiet ache, the slow, burning resilience, and the soft revolution she waged by simply surviving. In modern times, her memory was woven into exhibitions and restored manuscripts. At Westminster, a single stained glass panel, long thought to be generic, was re-identified as Isabella based on the embroidery on her sleeves, golden fleurs, this over a white rose. It had been overlooked for centuries, mistaken as decoration. Now, schoolchildren on history tours pause to look up at her delicate figure, wondering who she might have been. They read the plaque that now sits below it, Isabella of Valois 1389-1409, a queen too young, a widow too soon, but never without dignity. And in the end, perhaps that is what remained, not the power she never held, nor the wars she could not stop, but the imprint of quiet courage, a life spent not in shouting, but in listening, learning, and walking steadily forward, even when the path was paved in sorrow. She had crossed borders, spoken peace to kings, buried empires, borne a daughter, and chosen love, not once, but twice, and for all that, history nearly forgot her, but the stars remember.